Welcome back to Movie Recap. Today I'm gonna show you a 2013 American biographical war film called Lone Survivor. Spoilers ahead. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. The movie begins with a montage, showing the usual difficult and strict training that aspiring soldiers must undergo and pass in order to become a Navy SEAL. Afterwards, a wounded soldier, Marcus, is being transferred to a medical facility via helicopter. While he is being revived, Marcus cryptically narrates about the principle of pushing oneself further than he can imagine. The movie then cuts to 3 days earlier. Here, we catch a glimpse of the lives of the renowned Navy SEALs. Early in the morning, Lieutenant Murphy wakes up to see the content of his laptop. Upon seeing a message from his fiancée regarding a wedding present, as well as the attached picture of 2 majestic horses, he immediately heads toward Marcus' room. When asked about the horses, Marcus quickly responds that they are expensive. Without skipping a beat, Murphy then heads to Danny's room. Afterwards, Murphy and Danny conduct a race around the base. Meanwhile, another soldier, Axe, wakes up and immediately messages the love of his life about an upcoming mission. Shortly after, Murphy eventually wins their morning race by a hair. As the 2 competitors rest on the table with their fellow soldiers, Murphy is deciding if he will shave Danny's head as punishment for losing. They are then informed by the commanding officer, Eric, about the briefing of Operation Red Wings later. Soon after, the soldiers gather in a room to discuss about Operation Red Wings. In this operation, a group of soldiers will be sent near a village to capture and kill an important target named Shah, a man responsible for killing many soldiers in the past. The 4-man group that will be sent over consists of Murphy, Marcus, Danny, and Axe. While this briefing is happening, we catch a glimpse of Shah ordering the execution of a man in the village who is suspected of helping American forces. After the briefing, Danny discusses to his group about his wife's weird craving for interior designing back home, and his group immediately tells Danny that his wife might be pregnant. Afterwards, the whole regiment gathers in a small building. There, as a sort of tradition, they ridicule the new soldier by making him dance. After that hideous dancing, the new soldier then recites a speech describing the Navy SEALs. The following day, in the early hours of the day, the operation has finally commenced. As part of the plan, the 4-man group gets dropped on a location that is slightly far from the village. They then hike the steep terrain to their intended location. Upon reaching their final waypoint, Danny messages back to the base that they have already reached their intended location, but we can already see here that the communications are not very strong to begin with. Danny manages to relay the information after a couple of tries. With this, the soldiers back at the base then moves to phase 2 of the plan, which is transferring to another, much closer, base. Meanwhile, the 4-man group walks a bit closer to the village. As they reach a fairly secure position, Murphy then observes the village through a telescope. There, he already spots their primary target. However, he also notices that the enemy's number is greater than realized. But, despite this, Danny is having a hard time delivering this information back to base. As such, the group decides to move to a different, and much higher location. After moving, Marcus decides to continue talking about the horses that Murphy's wife wants. Afterward, while the group is resting, Danny sees a group of civilians walking towards them. The group consists of an elderly man and 2 children, who are shepherding goats. At first, the civilians fail to notice them because the soldiers are hidden from sight, but one of the children steps on Marcus' foot. Because they have no choice, the soldiers have to restrain the 3 civilians so that they can think of what to do with them. However, the situation gets complicated because one of the civilians is carrying a walkie-talkie, which means he might be in contact with the enemies. At first, the 4-man group tries to relay back to base about what happened, but the communication is still faulty. As such, Murphy decides to contact base via an unsecured call. The call manages to reach the new base, wherein Murphy immediately requests for Eric's presence. But upon getting Eric to the phone, the line is quickly cut due to the faulty connection. The soldiers at the base are starting to worry because the 4-man group has, so far, missed 2 calls from the base. Back in the mountains, Murphy offers 3 options. They can let go of the civilians and walk up the mountain. They can tie the civilians to the trees and leave them there, or they can kill them on the spot. Because of these choices, Marcus, Axe, and Danny debate about the fates of the 3 civilians, with Axe and Danny agreeing with the third option. Marcus, on the other hand, does not want to commit a war crime by killing unarmed civilians. In the end, Murphy, being the commanding officer of the group, makes the decision to let the civilians go. This is proven to be a disastrous decision, as the children immediately alerts the enemies about the Americans' presence. Meanwhile, the four-man group decides to rest on a false summit because they still can't contact their base. After a while, the group notices an eerie feeling that there are people nearby. As such, Murphy decides to check their surroundings, finding out that the enemies have already followed them. Because they are surrounded, the group has no choice but to fight against them. Shortly after, Marcus already notices an enemy hiding in the trees. After telling his fellow soldiers that he is about to start the battle, Marcus proceeds to kill the hiding enemy. Immediately, the whole situation descends into a gunfight, with the enemies clearly outnumbering the four-man group. At first, the group manages to hold the enemy onslaught, but because they are at a disadvantage, the Americans are slowly and individually wounded by the enemies. Amidst the battle, Danny tries to contact the base as he requests for immediate backup, but he gets shot in the right hand as a result. The four-man group eventually decides to move out of their place because they are slowly getting swarmed by the enemies. After a while of moving away, the group finally reaches a small precipice. Knowing there is no other way, Murphy tells the others that they have to jump. The group jumps off without skipping a beat. The group tumbles down through the steep and rocky terrain. After sliding down for a while, the group eventually stops their fall and meets up behind a great, big rock. There, Danny expresses his anger because his drawing hand is shot off from earlier. But, not allowing the group to rest, the enemies are quick to gang up on them. As such, the poor soldiers have no choice but to move and fight again. While moving away, Danny seems to feel tenser with each bullet fire. Eventually, one of the bullets found its way on his thigh, making him drop to the floor. As a result, the others have to carry him while running away. The group decides to stop again behind a rock. While there, Marcus, being the least wounded, checks up on everyone's condition. Meanwhile, the traumatized Danny is starting to break down from what had happened to him, commenting about the enemy's fast movement. However, the four-man group has to move again because the enemy catches up on them. As they are moving, they see yet again another precipice to jump on, but this time, it's a much higher fall. Still, because they have no other options, the group decides to jump down. Murphy and Axe are the first to jump down. Because Danny is badly injured, Marcus tries to carry him so that they can fall together. However, Danny gets shot in the shoulder. The force of the impact pushes Marcus slightly, enough for him to prematurely fall without Danny. As a result, Danny gets left behind at the top. After their much brutal fall, the three are quick to move again towards each other. While this is happening, the enemies who are the top surround the lone Danny. Axe tries to check up on Danny, but Danny is nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, the enemies loot Danny even though he is still alive. Learning that Danny is left behind, Murphy tells the two that they will get back Danny, and then kill the enemies afterward. As such, the now three-man group advances upon the enemies, with Axe firing while Murphy and Marcus climb the rocky terrain. Eventually, Marcus and Murphy concludes that it is difficult to climb back to the top. Murphy then decides that he will establish a communication with the base so that they can request for reinforcements, which he will do by climbing to a much nearer peak. He then gives his remaining magazines to Marcus so that they can climb much quicker. At first, Marcus tries to dissuade him from doing this deadly plan, but Murphy insists on continuing. After a while, Murphy manages to climb to the top. There, he calls back to the base, requesting for air support. Murphy manages to deliver the message, and their approximate position, even though he is not able to give his 10-digit grid coordinates. Shortly after, Murphy gets shot at the back, killing him. At the same time, Danny closes his eyes for the final time. The message, though incomplete, is enough for the Americans to send reinforcements to the group's approximate location. The reinforcements consist of 2 helicopters full of soldiers, with one of them being Eric. Down the precipice, Marcus and Axe converge together to talk. Axe, sensing that he will die soon, decides to tell Marcus a message for his wife. He asks Marcus to tell the love of his life that he loves her very much, and that he died alongside his brothers. Of course, Marcus shakes this off because he strongly believes that they will survive. However, this is immediately cut off as they receive another round of gunfire from the enemies. As a result, the 2 survivors split. Meanwhile, the reinforcements encounter a problem: they have no gunship support. This means that, while they can drop the soldiers to the ground, the helicopter carrying them is very vulnerable. As the 2 helicopters full of soldiers arrive, Marcus and Axe screams in joy because the battle is finally in their favors. As they are about to drop down, an RPG rocket hits their helicopter from the inside. In an instant, the helicopter falls down and explodes in a grim display, killing everyone, including Eric, on board. Because of this, the other helicopter has no choice but to retreat back to base. A soldier inside the helicopter tries to threaten the driver to turn around, but to no avail. They are in too much danger to continue. Understandably, the two soldiers lose hope on what had just transpired. What's worse is that Axe gets fatally wounded. Without any sign of hope for him, he crawls to a nearby tree while still firing at any enemy on sight. There, at the bark of the tree, he waits for his inevitable death, which is finally delivered to him by the enemies via a bullet to the head. On the other side of the terrain, Marcus calls Axe, but this is impossible now. As such, he is now the lone survivor. Marcus then, almost gets hit by a rocket, which pushes him down a rock. Because he is outnumbered, Marcus decides to hide underneath the rock while the enemies search for him. However, the enemies halt their search when helicopters fly by at their location, sparing Marcus for another day. The following day, Marcus wakes up, and immediately moves out of his hiding spot. While moving, Marcus sees a small lake where he happily jumps on. Suddenly, he sees a group of civilians. Due to an earlier life-changing encounter, Marcus is understandably tense with these civilians, as he threatens them with a grenade. However, these people are different, for they are helpful. Even though he is confused, Marcus decides to come with them. The men then bring Marcus to the same village as earlier. While moving him there, the villagers look at Marcus as if he is unwelcome. Afterward, the men manage to take Marcus to a house, where they attempt to communicate to him. Marcus asks them to point at his map about their exact location, and the villager generously helps him. After confirming, Marcus then writes a note behind the map. Another villager shouts at Marcus because his presence is very dangerous to the village. Marcus, offended by this unwelcome demeanor, threatens them with his grenade. The helpful villager, then, calms both sides. After confirming that he can trust them, Marcus then gives his letter to the villager, which the villager then passes to an elderly man. Afterwards, the elderly man sets off to the Americans' base to deliver the message. Meanwhile, the enemies track Marcus by finding his blood on the branches of plants. The enemies quickly find Marcus, and delivers him to a log post where they plan to behead him. But as they are about to swing the blade down to his neck, the villagers point their guns toward the enemies. As a result, the enemies leave the village, but promises to return. Upon returning to the villager's house, Marcus asks a child to get him a knife. Since the child cannot understand English, he gets a duck instead. Luckily, the villager understands a bit, but he still thought that Marcus meant to cut the duck. After getting the knife, Marcus proceeds to surgically remove the shrapnel stuck in his thigh. After the makeshift operation, the villager washes the blood from Marcus' body. Marcus then rests there for the night. The following day, both the villagers and the enemies are preparing for a battle. Afterwards, the helpful villager gives food and water to Marcus, which is quickly cut by an explosion nearby. Meanwhile, the Americans have already received and verified Marcus' letter, immediately providing reinforcement toward Marcus' location. Back to the village, the villager help moves Marcus, but they get quickly separated. Luckily, the two manages to overcome their individual battles. Shortly after, the reinforcements have finally arrived, immediately delivering hell to the enemies. The battle is over, and Marcus is quickly extracted out of the village. Marcus wants the villager to come with him, but they have to leave now. As such, Marcus thanks the villager profusely instead. We are now back at the beginning of the movie, where the medical personnel are attempting to revive Marcus. Shortly after, Marcus has a pulse again. The movie ends with a picture of the real four-man group who was deployed in the disastrous Operation Red Wings. In addition, we also learn that Marcus named his son, Axe, and that the villagers helped Marcus due to an age-old code of honor. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this to help the channel out. Have a nice day.